Did you know that a simple tin of corned beef could feed an entire family for 3 days in 1950s Britain? There was a time when Britain's working-class kitchens told the story of a nation, not through fancy restaurants or celebrity chefs, but through steaming plates of honest food that stretched tight budgets and filled hungry bellies after long shifts. From the smoky back-to-back terraces of Birmingham to the mining villages of Wales, these 25 meals didn't just feed families, they built communities, sparked romances over shared plates and created memories that lasted lifetimes. If you remember the smell of these sizzling on the hob after a long day at work, hit the like button and subscribe, because we're about to take a journey through Britain's most beloved working-class dinners. 1. Bangers and mash in the industrial heartlands of 1920s. Britain, when money was scarce and stomachs were empty, bangers and mash emerged as the ultimate comfort meal. These weren't gourmet Cumberland sausages. They were thick, fatty, mysterious tubes of meat and filler that cost pennies and could feed a family of 6 when paired with mountains of creamy mashed potatoes. The gravy was made from whatever vegetables were wilting in the pantry. But as rationing tightened its grip, even these simple pleasures began to change. By the 1940s, wartime meant that bangers became more bread and less meat. Yet, families still gathered around kitchen tables, sharing plates and stories, making every forkful count. And just when rationing finally ended, the very nature of British family dining was about to change forever. 2. Toad in the hole. The name sounds ridiculous now, but the toad in the hole was pure genius wrapped in Yorkshire pudding batter. The magic happened in those heavy cast iron pans that every working class kitchen owned, pans that had been passed down through generations, seasoned with decades of family meals. But the secret ingredient wasn't the past, it was the ritual. Fathers would carve it ceremoniously at the table while mothers fussed over vegetables. Children would argue over who got the biggest portion. But as convenience foods crept into British kitchens, the art of making proper Yorkshire pudding began to fade. 3. Pie and mash. Walk into any East End pie shop in the 1960s and you'd find Britain's working class at its most honest. Sleeves rolled up, queuing for steaming plates of pie and mash that cost a few shillings and tasted like home. The pies weren't fancy. Minced beef, sometimes more gravy than meat, encased in pastry that was thick enough to hold its secrets. The mash was pure white mountains of potato. But it wasn't just food, it was identity, served hot and eaten fast. These pie shops were temples of working-class culture. Men in flat caps would share tables with dock workers still dusty from the day's labour. And then, as London changed and gentrification crept in, these pie shops began to disappear one by one. 4. Fish and chips. Before McDonald's, before pizza delivery, before the internet changed how we ate, there was the chip shop. Britain's first fast food empire, built on newspaper-wrapped dreams and mushy peas. Friday night was fish and chips night. Not because it was payday, even though it often was, but because it was tradition, ritual, religion. And the real magic happened in those tiny shop fronts that lined every high street. The fish was fresh cod or haddock, battered and fried until it was golden perfection. The chips, real chips, thick cut and fluffy inside, crispy outside, were doused in malt vinegar and sprinkled with salt until they glistened like jewels. Behind the counter stood the chip shop owners. They knew every customer's order, every family's Friday night ritual. But as frozen fish fingers and oven chips invaded home kitchens, the weekly pilgrimage to the chippy slowly began to fade. 5. Bubble and squeak. Monday morning in a working-class kitchen meant one thing. Yesterday's roast dinner was about to get a glorious second life as bubble and squeak. Cold potatoes, sprouts, cabbage, carrots, anything that had survived the weekend would be chopped, seasoned and fried into crispy golden patties that tasted better than the original meal. But bubble and squeak was more than just clever cooking, it was survival. In homes where every penny counted, where waste was sin and creativity was necessity, this dish represented the genius of making do. But as prosperity grew and convenience foods arrived, the art of using every scrap was slowly being forgotten. 6. Corned beef hash. The tin opener was the most important tool in any working-class kitchen, and corned beef hash was its finest achievement. A tin of corned beef, a few potatoes, an onion if you were lucky, all fried together into a hearty, filling dish that could feed 6 people for less than a shilling. But the best part wasn't the eating, it was the gathering. Families would crowd around small kitchen tables, sharing from the same pan, talking about their days while scraping up the last crispy bits from the bottom. These weren't just meals, they were memories being made one forkful at a time. And then supermarket fridges filled with pre-prepared meals, and the art of transforming tins into feasts began to fade. 7. Spam fritters. When rationing ended but budgets remained tight, spam fritters became the treat that made Monday feel like Friday. Thick slices of processed pork shoulder, dipped in crispy batter and fried until golden, served with chips and beans. It was working-class luxury on a plate. But spam fritters were more than just cheap eating. They were rebellion. In a world that looked down on processed food, working-class Britain embraced it, transformed it, made it delicious. And then came the food snobs who declared processed meat beneath them, not realizing they were dismissing a cornerstone of British working-class cuisine. 8. Shepherd's pie. In the coal mining villages of Wales and the mill towns of Yorkshire, shepherd's pie wasn't just dinner, it was democracy on a plate. The foundation was always minced lamb, stretched with onions, carrots, and whatever vegetables were wilting in the pantry. But shepherd's pie was also the meal that stretched a Sunday joint into a week's worth of dinners. This was the meal that fed mining families after 12-hour shifts underground. A clever mother could make one small leg of lamb to feed her family for days, roasted on Sunday, cold on Monday, and minced for shepherd's pie on Tuesday. But as fresh meat became affordable year-round, the careful choreography of stretching Sunday's joint began to seem unnecessary rather than ingenious. 9. Liver and onions. Thursday night meant liver and onions in working-class kitchens across Britain. Calf's liver, lamb's liver, sometimes pig's liver when money was particularly tight. Whatever the butcher had that was affordable became dinner. But liver and onions represented something deeper than just budget cooking. The onions were the real stars, sliced thick and cooked slowly until they caramelized into sweet golden strands. This was the meal that connected British families to their agricultural past, to a time when every part of the animal was used. But as prosperity grew and choice expanded, organ meats began their slow retreat from British tables. 10. Faggots and mash. In the Black Country, where colder settled on everything and hard work was a religion, faggots weren't just meatballs, they were edible hugs wrapped in caul fat and seasoned with decades of tradition. Made from pork, offal, breadcrumbs and herbs, these weren't the prettiest things on the plate, but they were among the most delicious. But faggots were more than just economical eating, they brought people together. Every butcher had their own recipe, every family had their preference, every neighbourhood had passionate debates about whose were best. But as supermarket freezer cabinets filled with mass-produced alternatives, the artisanal craft of proper faggot making slowly disappeared from Britain's high streets. 11. Cottage pie. When the Sunday roast was beef instead of lamb, Tuesday's dinner became cottage pie, shepherd's pie's beefy cousin. The process was the same sacred ritual. Mince the leftover beef, add onions and carrots, stretch it with gravy and vegetables until it could feed the whole family. This was the meal that turned Monday's roast beef into Tuesday's celebration. Every family had their own twist. Some added Worcestershire sauce for tang, others included frozen peas for colour. But as ready meals appeared in supermarket freezers, the art of creating something special from yesterday's dinner began to fade. 12. Egg and chips. Sometimes the simplest meals are the most perfect, and egg and chips prove the truth every night in working-class kitchens across Britain. The chips came first, proper chips, thick cut and fluffy inside, fried until they were golden and crispy. Then, the eggs cracked into the same fat that had blessed the potatoes. But the magic was in the timing and technique. It was the meal for when pay packets were thin. But as exotic cuisines invaded British palates, simple egg and chips began to seem somehow primitive rather than perfectly satisfying. And if you're enjoying this journey through Britain's working-class kitchens, don't forget to subscribe. 13. Black pudding and mash. In the industrial towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where waste was sinful and every part of the pig was precious, black pudding became the breakfast that could fuel a 12-hour shift. Thick slices of blood sausage, studded with oatmeal and fat, fried until the outside was crispy and the inside remained soft and rich. Served alongside mountains of mashed potato, it was protein and comfort in its most concentrated form. But black pudding represented more than just economical protein, it was heritage. Recipes were passed down through generations, each family adding their own touches. Extra oatmeal for texture, different spices for flavour, variations in fat content that made each version unique. And then came the health scares and changing tastes that made blood sausage seem primitive rather than practical. 14. Steak and kidney pudding. When payday arrived and a few extra shillings jingled in working pockets, families might splurge on the king of British comfort food, steak and kidney pudding. The preparation was a labour of love that took most of the day. Chunks of beef and kidney would be browned and seasoned, then wrapped in pastry that was rolled thin and fitted into pudding basins like edible blankets. But this wasn't just Sunday dinner. This was a celebration. Steak and kidney pudding marked special occasions, birthdays, paydays, the end of particularly hard weeks. It was the meal that said, "We've made it through," that announced to the family that sometimes, just sometimes, they could afford to eat like kings. But as microwaves replaced steamers and convenience trumped ceremony, the long ritual of pudding making slowly disappeared from British kitchens. 15. Sausage and mash. Sausage and mash was the weeknight dinner that could transform the cheapest ingredients into complete satisfaction. The sausages were whatever the butcher had that was affordable, usually thick with breadcrumbs and mysterious with fillers, but the real secret ingredient was the ritual. Children would fight over who got the biggest sausage, parents would ensure everyone got equal portions of mash, and the gravy would be passed around like communion wine. But as food became more sophisticated and processed foods fell from favour, simple sausage and mash began to seem somehow insufficient. 16. Bacon and egg pie. In the mining communities of Wales and the industrial towns of the Midlands that could travel down mine shafts into factory break rooms and across fields to wherever hard work needed sustaining, the pastry was thick and sturdy, designed to protect its precious cargo during transport. But bacon and egg pie was more than just practical food. It was love made poor, that even when family members were scattered to their various labors, but as pre-packaged sandwiches invaded lunchboxes and convenience stores lined every corner, the Sunday ritual of pie making for the working week slowly faded away. 17. Mince and tatties. North of the border, mince and tatties ruled Scottish working-class tables with the authority of tradition and the comfort of simplicity. Minced beef, onions and potatoes, 3 ingredients that could feed a family. But mince and tatties represented something uniquely Scottish. The tatties were always boiled potatoes, floury varieties that would break apart slightly when mashed with butter and milk. They served as the perfect canvas for the rich mince, soaking up the flavours. And as Scotland changed and modernised, mince and tatties remained one of the few constants, a culinary anchor in a sea of social change. 18. Tripe and onions. In the mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where waste was sinful and every part of the animal was used, tripe and onions became the Wednesday night dinner that separated the adventurous from the squeamish. Honeycomb tripe, cleaned and prepared with the kind of care usually reserved for precious ingredients, would be simmered slowly with onions until it became tender and the cooking liquid transformed into rich, pale gravy. But tripe and onions was more than just nose-to-tail eating. It was about community. You either loved it or hated it. But as squeamishness overtook tradition and processed foods promised easier alternatives, tripe slowly vanished from British tables, taking with it centuries of culinary heritage. 19. Potato hash. When the week's vegetables were running low and the meat had already been stretched into yesterday's dinner, Potato hash became the miracle meal. The potatoes would be diced small and fried until they developed a golden crust, their edges crispy while their centers remained fluffy. Any leftover vegetables would join the party: cabbage, carrots, onions, whatever was available. But potato hash was also the canvas for creativity. Leftover meat could be stirred in, eggs could be cracked on top, cheese could be sprinkled over the finished dish. But as convenience foods multiplied and fresh ingredients became year-round luxuries rather than seasonal necessities, the art of making something from almost nothing began to fade. 20. Meat pie. Before Greggs conquered every high street, local bakeries produced meat pies that were architectural marvels of pastry and filling. They were robust constructions of thick pastry filled with minced meat, gravy, and vegetables. They could be eaten hot or cold, held in one hand while the other worked, carried in lunchboxes without fear of collapse. But meat pies were also social currency. A good pie shared was friendship offered, and a warm pie at the end of a cold day was comfort delivered. But as chain bakeries standardized recipes, the distinctive character of local meat pies slowly disappeared from Britain's high streets. 21. Chips and gravy. In the industrial heartlands of Britain, where simplicity was virtue and excess was suspicious, chips and gravy became the perfect marriage of convenience and comfort. The chips had to be perfect: thick cut, fluffy inside, golden outside, with just enough crispness to hold their structure under the weight of gravy. The gravy itself was an art form, but the ritual was sacred nonetheless. This wasn't restaurant food or celebration cuisine. This was the meal for when you needed comfort fast, when wages were tight, but spirits needed lifting. But as fast food chains imported different traditions, chips and gravy began to seem somehow outdated rather than timelessly satisfying. 22. Pasties. In the tin mines of Cornwall, miners needed food that could travel deep underground, survive hours in jacket pockets, and provide sustenance that would last through long shifts in darkness. The Cornish pasty was the perfect solution, a complete meal wrapped in edible packaging. The pastry was thick and strong, and the filling was layered carefully, meat and vegetables at one end, sometimes jam or fruit at the other. But pasties represented more than just practical eating. Crimping the edges with practiced fingers while her husband prepared for another dangerous descent into the darkness below. But as the mines closed and Cornwall transformed from industrial heartland to tourist destination, the humble pasty became a heritage curiosity. 23. Bacon sandwiches. Before artisanal bread and heritage pork transformed the humble bacon sandwich into gourmet fare, it was the working man's breakfast. The bacon was often streaky, fatty and fried until it was crispy enough to shatter between teeth, but still retained enough fat to flavour the bread. But the bacon sandwich was more than just quick sustenance. It was ritual. Saturday mornings meant the smell of bacon frying while fathers read the paper and mothers prepared for the week's shopping. This was the meal that fueled weekend football matches, that sustained workers through overtime shifts, that provided comfort after late nights at the pub. The technique was crucial: not too crispy, not too soft, with just enough fat left on to flavour the bread properly. And then health consciousness invaded British breakfasts, and the simple pleasure of a proper bacon sandwich began to seem somehow guilty rather than simply satisfying. 24. Jam roly-poly. When pudding was still called pudding and dessert was a foreign concept, jam roly-poly emerged from British working-class kitchens as the sweet ending that could transform any ordinary meal into a celebration. The suet pastry was rolled thin and spread with whatever jam was cheapest, usually strawberry or raspberry. It was the reward that made hardship bearable. Pennies had been saved throughout the week, when children had been good and fathers had avoided the pub. The preparation was a lesson in patience, rolling the pastry just right, but as convenience desserts filled supermarket shelves from British kitchens. 25. Bread and dripping. At the end of our journey through Britain's working-class table, we arrive at perhaps the humblest meal of all: bread and dripping. Two ingredients that could turn Sunday's roast into a week's worth of sustenance. The dripping was liquid gold, white fat streaked with dark, meaty jelly. Spread on bread and sprinkled with salt, it was cheap, hearty protein that gave a working body everything it needed. But bread and dripping was more than just making do, it was making magic. This was the meal that bridged breakfast and dinner, that satisfied afternoon hunger when dinner was hours away. The ritual was sacred in its simplicity. Thick slices cut from yesterday's loaf, the jar of dripping brought from the pantry, the careful spreading that scraped every precious bit. And as prosperity arrived and simple pleasures seemed insufficient, bread and dripping retreated to memory, taking with it the last connection to a time when food was precious. Nothing was wasted, and satisfaction came from the simplest combinations of honest ingredients. These 25 meals didn't just feed Britain's working class, they built the foundation of a culture, created bonds between families, and provided the fuel that powered a nation through its most challenging and transformative years. From the Industrial Revolution through 2 world wars, these dishes adapted, survived, and thrived because they understood something that fancy cuisine often forgets. Food isn't just about taste, it's about love, community, and the simple satisfaction of a belly well filled after an honest day's work. Which of these brings back the strongest memories for you? Share your stories in the comments below, and let's keep these culinary traditions alive for future generations to discover and appreciate.